Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
It's important to see when women particularly and kids are going through coercive control that this is essentially akin to being in a cult.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
Hello, this is Dr. Justin Coulson, the author of 6 books about raising happy families. I'm not with my wife and co-host today, Kylie, Mrs. Happy Families, and she's desperately disappointed because this is an interview that we've been looking forward to having today for just so very, very long. This is an interview that is not like our usual interviews. Normally we're talking about making families happy. This interview is about families that are dysfunctional in some of the worst ways. And that's because throughout the month of May, it's Domestic and Family Violence Prevention Month. Domestic and Family Violence Prevention Month is held every May to raise community awareness and promote a clear message that domestic and family violence will not be tolerated in our communities. Last year I read a book. It's called See What You Made Me Do. It's by Jess Hill, and it's a book about power, control, and domestic abuse. That is the violence and the controlling that can go on in far too many families, not just in Australia, but all over the world. Before we begin this interview, I just want to highlight that the content that we're going to discuss may be very distressing for some people. While we're going to do our best to keep it at a level that is safe, the reality is that conversations about domestic abuse, coercive control, and violence in families can be distressing and disturbing. The book was one of the most amazing books that I've read over the last several years. I made a big deal about it in my end-of-year book list last year. The book is called See What You Made Me Do, and Jess Hill is the author. Jess, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Justin. Thank you for having me.
Before we get into all the stuff that's going on at the moment in the world when it comes to domestic abuse, because this is becoming, fortunately, a topic that people are willing to talk about more now than ever. Why have you chosen to call the issue domestic abuse rather than domestic violence, which is what we normally hear in the media?
So it's based on the work of Yasmin Khan, particularly, who's a community services worker up here in Brisbane, works a lot with subcontinent, women from the subcontinent. And she really found that she was getting a lot of women coming into her service who would describe the most horrific campaigns of control and degradation, and they would say it's not really domestic violence because he's never hit me. And so she wrote this article basically calling for a change in the language from domestic violence to domestic abuse, because there are so many people who don't identify with the idea that they've been subjected to abuse because they've not experienced physical violence, or they've only experienced it sparingly. And so when I read that, it just felt immediately apparent that that's what we had to do. And the way that I kind of explain that is that we have a term for the abuse of children, which is child abuse. And inside that term, we contain the worst violence, but also the absence of contact, which is neglect. And I agree when people say that we don't want to sanitize the language, and I was worried that taking it from domestic violence to domestic abuse, it almost feels like it's sanitizing it. But actually, I think it's more important to be inclusive of people who haven't experienced much physical violence than to make the language somehow contain immediately the threat of it. Because I think, domestic violence doesn't contain what domestic violence actually is either. No term is really going to contain it, aside from some terms like intimate terrorism and others that don't really apply to every case of domestic abuse. So it's the best catch-all term.
What made you decide to research it? I mean, this is not the kind of thing where you're sitting around on a Friday night with friends saying, I'm really interested in how people hurt each other in their families. I think I'm going to go and write a book. Where did this idea come from for you? Because it's just such an extraordinary book and your heart is clearly in it, but it's not the kind of thing that people get excited about reading or writing.
Yeah, well, that's right. And in fact, there wasn't many opportunities while I was writing it to bring it up at any dinner parties I happened to go to.
I can't imagine.
It felt very private as a job. I think that I decided to write this book about it because I was still excited by it. And when I say excited, what I mean is that every time I would find something new out about domestic abuse or about the way our systems respond to it, it would blow my mind. And it would overturned so many of my own biases and misperceptions.
Could you give me an example of that? Like, let's be really concrete about this. What's one thing that you read and you just went, oh, I never thought of that?
So, for example, I thought for a long time that mothers who go to the family court would just, probably pretty commonly exaggerate allegations of domestic abuse to get an advantage in custody cases.
And there's a lot of stories about that, right? I mean, this comes up all the time, especially on Twitter.
Yeah. So, and about 40% plus of Australians believe that they routinely do that. And then it was the first conversation I had with a protective parent who's a mother, who told me about the fact that her lawyers had told her not to raise allegations of domestic abuse because it would probably sway the case against her and go against her favour. And that in fact had happened. And when her own children had made allegations of sexual abuse, it was reframed to be a result of her own anxiety projected onto the children, and that they had made those allegations to somehow please her. And the custody was switched entirely from their primary caregiver immediately to the father. And I thought that was maybe just a bit of a one-off. I thought that's a shocking story. But then I started looking at all the reports over the last 20 years and saw that is a pattern. And so
it's very, very provocative, isn't it, to come out and say this is a pervasive systemic issue that mothers, rather than the common narrative in some corners that mothers are embellishing abuse so that they can get custody, that they're actually being counselled to stay away from making those accusations at all because they might lose custody.
Precisely. And really, for years, that was just the standard legal advice. And still to this day, you have lawyers saying, well, maybe just don't put all of those allegations out. Even where there's been convictions, the basic pro-contact ethos of the court is that a child is better off with both parents, and only in the most exceptional circumstances should an abusive parent be prohibited from seeing that child, the result is frankly scandalous in terms of what's happening in this country.
Jess, you decided to write a book about domestic abuse because you uncover all of these unexpected truths that people don't usually understand. Just to be really clear, how do we define domestic abuse? Because we're going to talk about it for the next several minutes. It's probably important that we're really, really clear about what domestic abuse is.
Well, like on the, in terms of our legislation, every state has variations on how they define it. But generally speaking, it's known to include many different types of abuse, from physical to financial, spiritual, emotional, psychological, etc. We've now also come to the point where actually having children in an abusive household is defined as a type of abuse in itself, that children being exposed and living in that environment is abusive. So where I think we're going now with a better and more common understanding of coercive control is understanding that in some relationships you have violence or psychological abuse, etc., but where there's not a significant power imbalance. And you might actually have it coming from both sides. You might just have it coming from one side, but essentially there's not a total system in which a power imbalance is very clear. Then you have coercive control, which we think, affects about 60 to 80% of women who seek help. Could be much higher. There's not a lot of research on that. You've
raised this idea of coercive control. What is coercive control and how does it differ from domestic abuse, or is it a type of domestic abuse?
Yeah, some in the domestic violence sector will say this is the only thing they deal with. They don't deal with one-off incidents or, random patterns of assault. And what coercive control is essentially a system of entrapment to which various different techniques are used, including isolation, including intimidation and degradation, micromanagement of behaviour, so setting arbitrary rules and demands and then punishing the partner for breaking them, withholding necessary resources like money or access to transport, the abuse or threats to harm children and or pets or themselves, using that as a threat, humiliation and degradation, gaslighting, and essentially just creating this overarching environment of confusion, contradicting remarks, and a sense of extreme threat, a sense that the person is constantly having to walk on eggshells because they don't know when they're going to put a foot wrong next. And essentially, this whole system becomes a system of entrapment, and the ultimate goal is to reduce the victim to a state of compliance and dependency.
Jess, I remember as I read your book, I was overwhelmed several times and found myself laying in bed or sitting in my car weeping with sadness, and I'm feeling that again. I'm lost for words in so many ways. What I'd like to do is take a quick break and come back in just a sec and ask you, we could talk about so much that you've already covered, but I want to talk about what we can do to help if we know somebody who's going through this, or what we can do if it's us. So we're going to take a real quick break and come back in just a sec.
It's the Happy Families Podcast.
For a happier family, try a Happy Families membership, because a happy family doesn't just happen. Details at happyfamilies.com.au.
It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time poor parent who just wants answers now. And we're having a conversation that's really unusual for this podcast. I hope that you're doing okay, because the topic that we're talking about is one that is really hard to consider, especially if you live in a wonderful relationship where these kinds of things just don't happen. And it may be even harder to participate in a conversation like this if you're in a relationship where things aren't great and you have felt scared or threatened or afraid. I'm speaking with Jess Hill. Jess is the author of See What You Made Me Do, a book about power, control and domestic abuse. And a little over a year ago, I read this book and decided this was one of the best books that I've ever read, as hard as it was to read it, and that I just had to talk to Jess on the podcast because we've got Domestic Violence Prevention Month upon us right now. Jess, we've been talking about what domestic violence is, what coercive control is, who is affected by it and how. And I know that there's so much more that we could talk about. In your book, you talk about the way that police are involved, what's good and what's bad, what they're doing. You talk about why it's occurring, why men and women do so much damage to their intimate partners and to their children. You talk about the impact on women, on men, on the children themselves. And there are some things that I've read in that book that I don't know that I'll ever fully get over, because I was so moved, and so I felt like I'd been injured. I was so hurt for those children. But I really want to know what we can do. This is a podcast about giving people answers. If we know somebody who may be harmed, who may be in danger, what advice, having done years of research into this now, what advice do you have for somebody who is in a coercively controlling environment, in an environment where there is violence or some form of abuse, something that's going on that's just not right and shouldn't be occurring?
It's one of the hardest things is to support or try to support someone who is being subjected to this. And that is because I think it's very important, and this is not all abusive relationships, as I said earlier, but it's important to see when women particularly and kids are going through coercive control, that this is essentially akin to being in a cult. It's a coercive control is seen in cults. It's used in sex trafficking. It's used in hostage situations. And what it does is it makes itself invisible. And what is demanded of the people inside that system is loyalty to the perpetrator. And it's not just that they demand that loyalty, they do things so that that person feels like they must be loyal, both to protect themselves and also protect the perpetrator. Now, so when you're trying to talk to somebody about it, if you have suspicions about the fact that they may be being controlled or abused, you can find yourself being rebuffed. Or you can find someone saying, no, everything's fine, there's no problems here, when you know that there is a problem, you know that something is going on. Now, a lot of people, and I totally understand this, and I've been in this situation myself, end up backing away from those friends and family because they just cannot try to have that conversation again. It's just so depressing and so difficult. But what they do by doing that is they end up isolating that person almost on behalf of the perpetrator. Isolation is the most enduring thing for abuse. So if you are isolated and you have nobody to reflect back to you what you're going through, no one to speak to about it, no one to seek help from, that's when it becomes particularly trapping. So the best thing that you can do as someone who sees someone going through it or sees someone's kids going through it is make it very clear that you are not delivering an ultimatum, but you are open to talk at any time, that we will always be there. If they get to a point where they need a space of safety, that your phone is always on and that you'll be there for them, and that, you know, they can maybe come to your house, or that you'll be a place of refuge for them. If the children are in danger, or if there's a feeling of immediate risk, I think sometimes you have to make that really horrific decision or think about calling police. Sometimes it's out of your hands. You know, sometimes the threat is so great and there may be so much resistance on behalf of the victim survivor, which may be totally relevant, but you may have no other choice. And that's a horrible sort of point to be at. If you're in a coercive control relationship or an abusive relationship, or with an abusive partner, I should say, and you're not sure what to do next, and if you know that what you're going through, or maybe you've only just twigged having listened to the behaviours described, the best first step for people is to develop a safety plan. Now, that does not mean that you're necessarily planning to leave. What it means is you need to develop some plan for if things escalate, or how you are going to achieve greater safety in whatever way that looks. Maybe it looks like you staying in the relationship for now, but do you confide in one trustworthy person so that you've got someone to speak to about it? Maybe it does look like leaving, and you go, okay, I need to speak to maybe a domestic violence caseworker, or even just get together copies of your important documents so that if you have to run out the door, you're not going with, you know, $1 in your pocket and no access to your records. So, and you have somewhere to go, and you've got a bit of a plan for how that might happen. Safety planning is the first step, I think, you know, really to creating a space of change. But talking to people, reading the literature if you can, if it's safe. One victim of coercive control actually listened to my book on audiobook, so she would listen to it in headphones as she'd be doing the washing up, because she couldn't have the physical book in the room. So there are different ways in which you can engage with this stuff and learn about it. There's, you know, the only way to protect yourself against coercive control is to understand it and be able to spot it and to know it for what it looks like and how it feels. And the really important message to send to victim survivors is you can't fix your partner. They have to fix themselves. Don't hang in a dangerous situation for you or for your kids in the hope that your partner is going to magically be fixed or changed just through the power of your love. It would be beautiful if that was the case, but unless they are absolutely genuinely engaged in the process of change, and even if they are, it's not your responsibility to live in harm, to wait for that change to occur.
In summary, if you know somebody, be a safe person for them, be a trusted and safe person for them to talk to, and hopefully one day they'll rely on you to do something to help them. Call the police if you need to, and if you're in the environment, get that safety plan in place and find someone that you can talk to. That's what I've heard you say in summary.
Yep, that's basically right.
Jess, the book is called See What You Made Me Do. It's by Jess Hill, Power Control and Domestic Abuse. It's such a hard topic to talk about. I'm so grateful for your generosity in sharing your wisdom and your learning with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Justin.
Well, I think I need to go and have a bit of a lay down after that conversation. It's hard to put into words how affected I am by it, and I just so wish that Kylie could have been here. Unfortunately, our family commitments meant that I couldn't have Kylie with me in this conversation, which is just so sad because it's been such a great conversation. Nevertheless, if you've enjoyed the podcast for what it was, and if you have feedback for us, we welcome that feedback. podcasts@happyfamilies.com.au. You can also jump onto Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. Those ratings and reviews help other people to find the podcast and make their families happier. We appreciate the work, as always, of Justin Rulon from Bridge Media for producing the podcast, and Craig Bruce, our executive producer. For more information about how to make your family happier, please visit happyfamilies.com.au.